A lumberjack gets trapped under a tree in the forest, but a wolf appears out of nowhere and does something no one would believe. The ending will break your heart. In the dense forests of Oregon's Cascade Range, where ancient Douglas firs reach toward the heavens like nature's skyscrapers, Mason Blackwood prepared for another day of work. The early morning mist clung to the moss-covered ground, creating an ethereal atmosphere that only those familiar with the Pacific Northwest could truly appreciate. At 45, Mason was one of the most experienced loggers in Willow Creek, a small town where the lumber industry had been the backbone of the community for generations. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us from which city you are watching us. The familiar scent of fresh-cut wood and damp earth filled his nostrils as he surveyed the area, carefully selecting his next target. 20 years in the business had taught him to respect the forest's power and unpredictability. Each tree had its own character, its own way of falling, and Mason prided himself on reading them like open books. His colleagues often joked that he had a sixth sense when it came to logging, but he knew it was simply experience combined with careful observation. That morning, something felt different. The forest seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. Mason had learned to trust his instincts over the years, but he also had quotas to meet. The lumber company was pushing for increased production, and as one of their most reliable contractors, he couldn't afford to fall behind schedule. His daughter Sarah's college tuition wouldn't pay itself, and after losing his wife Jenny to illness 5 years ago, he carried the weight of being both provider and parent alone. He approached a particularly impressive Douglas fir, its trunk straight and true, exactly the kind the mill was looking for. Mason calculated the fall line meticulously, accounting for the slight slope of the terrain and the surrounding vegetation. Everything about the cut looked textbook perfect on paper, but that nagging feeling in his gut wouldn't subside. Still, he pressed on. The whine of his chainsaw shattered the morning silence. The cut went smoothly at first, exactly as planned. Mason worked with precision, creating the perfect notch that would direct the tree's fall. The morning sun had begun to burn away the mist, sending shafts of golden light through the canopy above. He was so focused on maintaining the perfect angle that he almost missed the sudden shift in the wind. Almost. The first warning came as a whisper, a subtle change in the way the branches swayed overhead. Mason's experienced eyes caught the movement, but it was already too late. The wind channeled through the natural corridor of the forest, hitting with unexpected force. The massive tree, partially severed from its base, began to shift unpredictably. Mason moved to adjust, to compensate for the change, but the forces of nature had other plans. Time seemed to slow as he watched the trunk begin its descent, not in the carefully planned direction, but at an angle that sent it straight toward him. His muscles reacted instinctively, but the uneven ground betrayed his escape attempt. The impact came with a sound that seemed to shake the entire forest, and Mason found himself pinned, his leg trapped beneath the massive weight of the fallen giant. The initial shock gave way to searing pain, and Mason's first instinct was to call for help. But he knew the futility of it. He was working alone in this section, and the nearest crew was at least a mile away. His radio lay crushed beneath the fallen tree, and his cell phone showed no signal, a common problem in these remote areas. The reality of his situation began to sink in as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Hours passed like centuries as Mason tried everything he could think of to free himself. The pain in his leg had become a constant companion, and the weight of the tree seemed to increase with each passing minute. He thought of Sarah, waiting at home for him to return, probably working on her college applications. The thought of her gave him renewed strength, but even that wasn't enough to overcome the immovable mass that held him captive. As the afternoon wore on, the forest's character began to change. The friendly green cathedral of the morning transformed into something more primitive and threatening. Shadows lengthened, and the temperature began to drop. Mason had seen enough accidents in his career to know that exposure could be just as dangerous as any physical injury. The thought of spending the night trapped in the increasingly cold forest sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The first sign that something had changed came as a subtle shift in the forest's atmosphere. Mason, fighting against exhaustion and discomfort, noticed how the usual evening chorus of birds had suddenly gone silent. His years in the wilderness had taught him to read these signals. When the forest goes quiet, it usually means a predator is nearby. The thought sent a new wave of anxiety through his already stressed body. Through the growing darkness, a movement caught his eye. Something was approaching through the underbrush, moving with the fluid grace that only a wild creature could possess. Mason's heart rate quickened as a massive gray wolf emerged from the shadows, its amber eyes reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. It was larger than any wolf he'd ever seen, with a distinctive white patch on its chest that seemed to glow in the dim light. Mason had encountered wolves before during his years in the forest, but never this close and never in such a vulnerable position. His mind raced through everything he knew about wolf behavior, trying to determine if this was a lone wolf or if there might be others nearby. The wolf's appearance was unusual. Most wolves avoided human contact, especially in daylight hours. The animal approached cautiously, each step deliberate and measured. Mason remained as still as possible, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger an aggressive response. But there was something different about this wolf's behavior. Instead of the predatory stance he expected, the wolf's body language suggested curiosity rather than aggression. It moved closer, nose working the air, analyzing the situation with an intelligence that seemed almost human. To Mason's astonishment, the wolf began to circle the fallen tree, occasionally pawing at the ground around where his leg was trapped. It reminded him of the search and rescue dogs he'd seen during forest emergency training sessions, methodical and purposeful in their movements. The rational part of his mind told him this was impossible. Wolves don't help humans, they're wild animals driven by instinct and survival. Yet here was this magnificent creature, seemingly analyzing his predicament. The wolf's behavior became even more extraordinary. It began to dig at the soil around the tree trunk, its powerful paws moving earth with surprising efficiency. Mason watched in disbelief as the animal worked, occasionally pausing to look at him with those penetrating amber eyes, as if checking to see if its efforts were helping. The soil being moved created a slight shift in the pressure on his leg, not enough to free him, but enough to show that the wolf's actions were having an effect. As darkness settled more firmly over the forest, Mason's thoughts turned to Sarah again. She would be worried sick by now. He always called when he was running late, and it was well past his usual return time. The town would probably organize a search party, but finding one person in these vast woods at night would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the thin jacket he wore provided little protection against the biting cold of an Oregon night. The wolf continued its efforts, now using its shoulder to push against smaller branches that had fallen alongside the main trunk. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something unprecedented in all his years in the forest. All the stories he'd heard around campfires and in logging camps, he'd never heard of anything like this. The wolf's actions seemed too deliberate, too focused to be random. A sharp crack echoed through the forest as one of the branches the wolf was pushing suddenly snapped. The sound startled both man and beast, but instead of fleeing, the wolf quickly returned to its task. It now had a new tool. The broken branch became a lever, and Mason watched in amazement as the wolf attempted to wedge it under the fallen tree. The level of problem-solving he was witnessing defied everything he thought he knew about wild animals. The pain in Mason's leg had become a constant throb, but the cold was now his bigger concern. His fingers had gone numb, and he could feel the chill seeping into his bones. The wolf's presence, oddly enough, provided some comfort in the growing darkness. There was something in those intelligent eyes that seemed to promise he wouldn't face this night alone. The wolf's persistence with the branch created a small miracle. The improvised lever, combined with the loosened soil around the trunk, created just enough space for Mason to attempt to free his leg. With renewed hope and gathering all his remaining strength, he pulled, fighting against the crushing weight and the screaming pain that shot through his entire body. The small gap was enough, and with one final effort, he managed to slide his leg free from beneath the massive trunk. The relief of being released was immediately overshadowed by the intense pain that followed. Mason's leg was clearly injured, though in the dim light, he couldn't assess the full extent of the damage. He attempted to stand but immediately crumpled back to the ground, his leg unable to support any weight. The wolf took a few steps back, watching his attempts with what seemed like concern in its intelligent eyes. The temperature continued to drop as night settled fully over the forest. The stars began to appear through the canopy above, their cold light doing little to dispel the darkness that surrounded him. Mason knew he needed to find shelter or help soon. The nights in these mountains could be deadly, especially to someone injured and exposed to the elements, but with his injured leg, he could barely move, let alone make his way through the treacherous forest terrain in the dark. To his surprise, the wolf hadn't left. It remained nearby, occasionally pacing back and forth. Its behavior was unlike anything Mason had ever encountered in his years of working in these woods. The animal seemed almost anxious, as if it understood the gravity of the situation. Mason found himself talking to the wolf, his voice rough from hours of shouting for help earlier in the day. "Well, friend," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the pain and cold, "I don't suppose you know the way to the nearest ranger station?" He chuckled weakly at his own joke, but the sound died in his throat as the wolf's ears suddenly perked up. It turned its head sharply, looking into the darkness of the forest, and for a moment, Mason feared that less friendly predators might be approaching. The wolf let out a low howl that echoed through the trees. The sound sent shivers down Mason's spine, not from fear, but from the haunting beauty of it. The howl seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading into the night. Then, to Mason's amazement, answers came from the darkness. Two distinct howls responded from different directions, getting closer with each passing minute. Through the shadows, two more wolves emerged, their movements as fluid and graceful as the first. They were slightly smaller, but no less impressive, their fur silvered in the starlight. They approached cautiously, communicating with the first wolf through subtle movements and soft vocalizations that Mason could barely hear. It was like watching a silent conversation unfold before his eyes. The three wolves seemed to reach some sort of agreement. The first wolf, the one with the white patch on its chest, moved closer to Mason again. Its behavior was different now, more determined. It gently grabbed the sleeve of Mason's jacket with its teeth, careful not to harm him. The intention became clear, it was trying to pull him. The other two wolves positioned themselves on either side, and Mason realized with astonishment that they were attempting to move him. Despite everything he knew about wild animals, despite the voice of reason in his head telling him this couldn't be happening, Mason found himself trusting these mysterious creatures. He was too weak to walk, too injured to save himself, and these wolves seemed to be his only chance. The alternative was spending the night in the freezing forest, which he knew could be fatal. The wolves worked with surprising coordination, carefully dragging him across the forest floor. They moved slowly but purposefully, choosing the easiest path through the underbrush. Mason could feel the cold ground beneath him as they pulled him along, but the wolves' movements were surprisingly gentle, as if they understood his injured state. They paused occasionally, allowing him to rest and adjust his position, always keeping watch over their surroundings. As they traveled through the dark forest, Mason drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain and cold taking their toll on his body. The wolves never left his side, maintaining their steady pace through the wilderness. In his more lucid moments, he marveled at the impossibility of what was happening. These wild predators, animals that humans had feared and hunted for generations, were now his rescuers. The journey through the dark forest seemed endless. Mason's world had narrowed to the rhythmic movement of being pulled across the ground, the occasional pause when the wolves needed to navigate around obstacles, and the constant battle to stay conscious. The cold had settled deep into his bones, but the presence of the three wolves provided an unexpected source of warmth. When they stopped for brief rests, the lead wolf, the one with the distinctive white patch, appeared to be orchestrating the rescue effort. It would scout ahead, return to check on Mason, and communicate with the other two wolves through a series of subtle vocalizations. The coordination between the three animals was remarkable, almost supernatural in its precision. They worked together like a well-trained search and rescue team, though Mason knew such a comparison should be impossible. During one of their rest stops, Mason's thoughts drifted to his daughter, Sarah. She would be beside herself with worry by now. At 17, she was mature beyond her years, having grown up faster than she should have after losing her mother. The thought of her sitting by the phone, waiting for news, gave him renewed determination to stay alert and keep fighting against the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. The forest around them had changed as they traveled. The dense undergrowth gradually gave way to slightly more open terrain, and Mason noticed the ground beneath him becoming firmer, more compact. The wolves' movements became more purposeful, as if they were following a specific path. Despite his clouded mind, Mason realized they weren't moving randomly through the woods. They appeared to be heading in a deliberate direction. Through the canopy above, Mason caught glimpses of the star-filled sky. The Big Dipper hung low on the horizon, and he tried to use it to orient himself, a habit born from years of woodland experience. They seemed to be moving eastward toward where he knew the nearest road cut through the forest. Could these wolves actually be leading him towards civilization? The idea seemed absurd, yet everything about this night had defied the natural order. He thought he understood the white-patched wolf. Suddenly, it stopped, causing the others to pause as well. Its ears were erect, alert to some sound that Mason's human ears couldn't detect. The wolf lifted its head and seemed to test the air, its nostrils flaring as it processed information that was invisible to Mason. After a moment, it made a decision, adjusting their course slightly to the left. The ground beneath Mason had definitely changed. He could feel the transition from soft forest floor to something more solid. The wolf's pace made different sounds now, clicking occasionally against what he realized must be stone. They had reached some kind of path or road. His heart began to race with renewed hope. If they were on a road, there was a chance someone might pass by. The wolves continued their careful progress, but their behavior had changed subtly. They seemed more alert, more cautious, as if approaching the edges of their comfort zone. The white-patched wolf kept looking back at Mason, its amber eyes reflecting what little light filtered through the trees. There was an almost human-like concern in that gaze, a depth of intelligence that challenged everything Mason thought he knew about wild animals. Suddenly, a sound cut through the night, the distant rumble of an engine. The wolves froze, their ears pivoting toward the noise. Mason's heart leaped in his chest. That sound meant civilization, meant help, meant survival. The wolves gently dragged him a few more feet, positioning him where the starlight filtered more clearly through the trees. The white-patched wolf approached him one last time, touching its nose briefly to his hand in what felt like a gesture of farewell. Through his blurred vision, Mason saw headlights approaching in the distance, cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. The wolves melted away into the shadows as silently as they had appeared, leaving him at the edge of what he now realized was one of the old logging roads. The vehicle was getting closer, its headlights illuminating the trees in sweeping arcs as it rounded the curves of the mountain road. The last thing Mason saw before the wolves disappeared completely was the white-patched wolf standing at the forest's edge, its magnificent silhouette outlined against the darkness. Their eyes met one final time, and in that moment, Mason felt he understood something profound about the connection between all living things, something that went beyond the simple categories of wild and tame, human and animal. The approaching vehicle turned out to be an old pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Behind the wheel was Jim Henderson, a local farmer who made it his habit to check his far-flung fields even at odd hours. When his headlights caught the shape of a man lying by the roadside, Jim slammed on his brakes, sending gravel flying in all directions. "Good Lord!" Jim exclaimed as he rushed from his truck, his flashlight beam dancing across Mason's prone form. "Mason? Mason Blackwood, is that you?" The farmer knelt beside him, his weathered face creased with concern. "What in heaven's name are you doing out here? The whole town's been searching for you." Mason tried to speak, but his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. His body, now that rescue was at hand, seemed to be shutting down, surrendering to the exhaustion and cold it had been fighting for so long. Jim quickly grabbed blankets from his truck, wrapping them around Mason's shivering form while pulling out his cell phone to call for help. "Betty, get Williams on the phone right now." Jim spoke urgently into his phone. "I found Mason Blackwood out on the old logging road past Miller's Creek. He's alive, but in rough shape. Call the search parties and tell them to head back in." He turned back to Mason, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. "Hang in there, friend. Help's coming." As they waited for the ambulance, Jim tried to make sense of how Mason had ended up miles from where his truck had been found. The search parties had discovered Mason's vehicle hours ago, but there had been no sign of him in the immediate area. The distance he had somehow covered, especially with an injured leg, made no sense. "The wolves," Mason managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "They brought me here. 3 of them. One with a white patch." He struggled to keep his eyes open, desperate to share his incredible story. Jim listened with growing concern, wondering if his friend was delirious from the cold and pain. The sound of sirens pierced the night as an ambulance negotiated the rough logging road, followed by several vehicles carrying members of the search party who hadn't yet called off their efforts. Among them was Sarah, who had refused to go home despite repeated urging from the search coordinators. She leapt from one of the cars before it had fully stopped, running to her father's side. "Dad," she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. "Oh, God, Dad." Tears streamed down her face as she grabbed his hand, which felt ice-cold in her warm grip. The paramedics worked quickly, assessing Mason's condition and preparing him for transport. Sarah refused to let go of his hand even as they lifted him onto the stretcher. "The wolves." "Sarah," Mason mumbled, fighting to stay conscious. "They saved me. You have to believe me." Sarah exchanged worried glances with Jim Henderson, who shook his head slightly, suggesting they should humor him for now. The paramedics were more concerned with Mason's physical condition, the severe hypothermia, the injured leg, and possible internal injuries from the original accident. As they loaded Mason into the ambulance, Sheriff Tom Parker arrived on the scene, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. He'd been coordinating the search efforts and was baffled by how Mason had ended up so far from his last known location. Jim pulled him aside and quietly related Mason's strange tale about the wolves. "Wolves," the sheriff repeated incredulously. "Jim, we haven't had a confirmed wolf sighting in this part of Oregon for years. Maybe a few strays passing through, but nothing like what he's describing. The cold and trauma must have caused him to hallucinate." But even as the sheriff spoke, his flashlight beam caught something in the dirt by the roadside, paw prints, large ones, multiple sets, leading up to where Mason had been found and then disappearing back into the forest. The sheriff stared at them for a long moment, his certainty wavering slightly. Sarah rode in the ambulance with her father, holding his hand as they made their way to the regional medical center in Bend. She listened as he drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of his incredible story, the accident with the tree, the appearance of the first wolf, its unusual behavior, and finally, the arrival of the others who had helped drag him to safety. At Cascade Regional Medical Center, Mason's story spread quickly among the hospital staff, visitors, and eventually throughout the tight-knit community of Willow Creek. His room became a gathering place for curious visitors, each hoping to hear firsthand about the mysterious wolves that had supposedly rescued him from certain tragedy in the forest. Dr. Rebecca Collins, the attending physician, focused on Mason's physical recovery while listening to his account with professional skepticism. "Mr. Blackwood," she said during one examination, checking his injured leg, "the human mind can create very vivid experiences when under extreme stress. What you're describing, well, it's unprecedented in medical literature." But Mason remained adamant about what had happened. Each time he told the story, the details remained consistently precise: the white-patched wolf's intelligent eyes, the coordinated effort to free him, the careful way they had transported him through the forest. Sarah sat by his bedside, watching his face light up with wonder every time he described the wolves' behavior. "I know how it sounds," Mason told a group of fellow loggers who had come to visit. "If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But those wolves, they knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't just random animal behavior. They made decisions, worked together, used tools. Even that first wolf, the one with the white patch, it used a branch as a lever." "How do you explain that?" News of Mason's extraordinary rescue reached beyond Willow Creek. A wildlife biologist from Oregon State University, Dr. Elena Martinez, arrived to interview him about his experience. She spent hours taking detailed notes, particularly interested in his descriptions of the wolves' problem-solving behavior and coordinated actions. While wolves are indeed intelligent animals with complex social structures, Dr. Martinez explained, the behavior you're describing goes beyond anything documented in scientific literature. However, she paused, consulting her notes. There have been rare accounts throughout history of wolves displaying unusual behavior toward humans. Most were dismissed as folklore, but perhaps we've been too quick to discount these stories. Sarah found herself becoming her father's strongest advocate. She had grown up listening to his stories about the forest, learning to trust his judgment and experience. My dad's not someone who makes things up, she told Dr. Martinez firmly. He spent his whole life in these woods. He knows the difference between normal animal behavior and what happened that night. The physical evidence supported at least parts of Mason's story. Sheriff Parker had photographed the paw prints found at the rescue site, and Dr. Martinez affirmed they were indeed wolf tracks. The drag marks in the soil matched Mason's account of being pulled through the forest, and the distance from the accident site to where he was found would have been impossible for him to cover alone with his injured leg. Late one evening, when the stream of visitors had finally ended, Sarah sat alone with her father. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital at night. "Dad," she said softly, "tell me again about the wolf with the white patch, the first one that found you." Mason's eyes took on a distant look as if seeing something far beyond the hospital walls. "There was something in its eyes, Sarah, something I can't quite explain. It wasn't just intelligence. It was like it could see right through me, understand exactly what I needed. When it looked at me, I didn't see a wild animal. I saw, I don't know, something more. The incident had changed something in Mason. The other loggers noticed it when they visited. The way he talked about the forest was different now. There was a new depth to his understanding, a sense of connection that went beyond his professional knowledge. He spoke about the need to respect the wilderness, not just as a resource to be harvested, but as a place of mysteries that humans had barely begun to understand. Dr. Collins noted Mason's remarkable recovery rate, commenting that his injuries should have been far worse given the circumstances. The leg, though badly bruised, showed no signs of the crushing damage she had expected from being pinned under a massive tree. It was as if something had prevented the full weight from settling on him, another detail that added to the growing mystery of his survival. As Mason's recovery progressed, he found himself drawn back to the forest, but not in the same way as before. During his rehabilitation walks prescribed by Dr. Collins, he would stand at the edge of the woods near his home, studying the tree line with new eyes. Every shadow between the trunks held the possibility of his mysterious saviors. Though he hadn't seen the wolves since that extraordinary night, Sarah noticed the change in her father most clearly during their conversations over dinner. The man who had once viewed the forest primarily as a source of livelihood now spoke of it with an almost reverential tone. "It's like I was blind before," he told her one evening, absently stirring his coffee. "I knew the forest, but only on the surface. There's so much more going on in there than we understand." The logging company had offered Mason a supervisory position that would keep him away from direct cutting work, citing concerns about liability after his accident. But Mason had surprised everyone by requesting a different role entirely. He wanted to work with the company's conservation department, helping to identify areas that should be preserved rather than harvested. You should have seen their faces, he told Sarah, chuckling at the memory of the meeting with company executives. They probably thought I'd lost my mind. But something changed out there that night. I can't go back to seeing the forest as just trees to be cut down. His new perspective began to influence others in unexpected ways. Young loggers sought his advice, not just about cutting techniques but about understanding the forest itself. Mason taught them to read the signs he'd always known, but now with an added layer of appreciation for the complex web of life that existed beneath the canopy. Dr. Martinez continued to visit, bringing questions from her colleagues in the scientific community. She had written a preliminary paper about Mason's experience, focusing on the observed problem-solving behavior of the wolves. While many of her peers dismissed the account, a few were intrigued enough to begin their own investigations into wolf intelligence and behavior. There's been a lot of interest in your story from wildlife researchers, she told Mason during one of her visits, especially the detail about the wolf using the branch as a lever. We've documented tool use in corvids and primates, but this level of problem-solving in wolves challenges our entire understanding of canid intelligence. During his regular checkups, Dr. Collins remained amazed at his recovery. Whatever happened out there, she admitted, reviewing his latest X-rays, your body is healing remarkably well. The trauma to your leg should have left lasting damage, but it's almost as if you had immediate medical attention right after the accident. Sarah had taken to accompanying her father on his walks along the forest edge. She noticed how he would stop at certain points, listening intently to the sounds of the wilderness. Sometimes, he would smile mysteriously, as if recognizing a familiar voice in the wind through the trees. She never pressed him about these moments, understanding that some experiences went beyond words. One evening, as they walked their usual path, Mason suddenly stopped. Sarah followed his gaze to the tree line, where for just a moment, she thought she saw a flash of gray fur and the gleam of intelligent eyes. Her father's face lit up with recognition, but before he could say anything, the shadow melted back into the forest. Was that? Sarah whispered, her heart racing with excitement. I don't know for sure, Mason replied softly, but his expression told a different story. But I feel them sometimes, watching over this part of the forest. It's like they're making sure we understand something important about this place, about our relationship with it. The story of Mason's miraculous rescue began to affect Willow Creek in subtle but significant ways. Local teachers invited him to speak to their classes about forest conservation and wildlife preservation. Children listened wide-eyed as he described the intelligence and compassion he had witnessed in creatures that many had been taught to fear. Their young minds, unburdened by rigid skepticism, embraced the possibility that nature held deeper mysteries than adults typically acknowledged. Frank Miller, owner of the logging company where Mason worked, found himself increasingly influenced by Mason's transformed perspective. During a company meeting, he announced a new initiative to balance logging operations with conservation efforts. Mason's experience, he told the board members, has made us reconsider our approach to forest management. Maybe it's time we looked at these woods not just as a resource, but as a legacy we need to protect. Sarah noticed how her father's story had begun to change the town's relationship with the surrounding wilderness. Hunting permits in the area decreased significantly, and the local council started discussing the creation of protected wildlife corridors. Even the most hardened skeptics couldn't deny that something remarkable had occurred that night in the forest. Dr. Martinez's research gained unexpected support from the academic community. Her paper about Mason's experience, initially met with skepticism, sparked a broader discussion about animal intelligence and interspecies cooperation. She organized a small conference in Willow Creek, bringing together wildlife experts, behavioral scientists, and local forest workers to share their observations and experiences. What we're seeing here, she explained during her presentation, challenges our traditional understanding of wildlife behavior. The coordinated rescue effort described by Mr. Blackwood suggests levels of problem-solving and empathy in wolves that we've never documented before. But perhaps that's because we've never really looked. The conference attracted unexpected attention from environmental groups and conservation organizations. They were particularly interested in Mason's new role at the logging company and how his experience had led to changes in local forest management practices. Several organizations approached him about serving as a consultant on wildlife protection initiatives. During one of their evening walks, Sarah noticed her father had become unusually quiet. "What's on your mind, Dad?" she asked as they paused at their usual spot overlooking the forest. "I've been thinking about your mother," he replied softly. "She always told me there was more to these woods than what we could see. Remember how she used to tell you stories about the spirit of the forest? About how all living things were connected in ways we couldn't understand. I didn't pay much attention back then, but now." Sarah remembered those stories well. Her mother had been an amateur naturalist, spending hours photographing wildlife and recording her observations in detailed journals. After her illness, those journals had been packed away, too painful to look at. Now, Sarah realized they might hold new meaning. That evening, they pulled out the old journals together. Among her mother's careful notes and sketches, they found several entries about wolf behavior. She had documented multiple instances of wolves displaying unusual intelligence and awareness, though nothing as extraordinary as Mason's experience. One sketch in particular caught their attention, a wolf with a distinctive white patch on its chest, observed in the same area where Mason had been rescued. "Look at the date," Sarah said, her finger trembling slightly as she pointed to the entry. It was from 15 years ago, yet the description matched perfectly with the wolf that had led Mason's rescue. "How is that possible?" Mason studied the sketch, a strange expression crossing his face. "Wolves don't live that long in the wild. Maybe," he said carefully, "we're not just dealing with ordinary wolves. Your mother always said there were ancient powers in these forests, things that existed long before humans came here. I didn't believe her then, but now." Sarah spent the next few days immersed in her mother's journals, discovering a side of Jenny Blackwood she had never fully understood. The pages were filled with not just wildlife observations, but also local legends and stories passed down through generations about the spiritual connection between the forest and its inhabitants. One particular entry caught her attention, dated just months before her mother's illness. "The white-patched wolf appeared again today," Jenny had written. "There's something different about this creature, an awareness in its eyes that seems almost human. The local Native Americans speak of guardian spirits that take animal form to watch over these lands. I used to think these were just stories, but after today's encounter, I'm not so sure anymore." Mason found Sarah in her room, surrounded by open journals spread across her bed. "Dad," she said, looking up with tears in her eyes, Mom knew. She knew there was something special about these wolves, about this forest. "Listen to this." She read another entry describing how the white-patched wolf had led Jenny to an injured eagle, demonstrating what appeared to be deliberate communication and concern for another species. The discovery of Jenny's journals sparked new interest from Dr. Martinez and her research team. The detailed observations, spanning over a decade, provided valuable historical context to Mason's experience. These journals suggest a pattern, Dr. Martinez explained, carefully examining Jenny's notes. Your wife wasn't just recording random wildlife sightings. She was documenting repeated interactions with what appears to be the same wolf, or at least one with very similar markings. The local tribal elders, who had remained silent about Mason's story until now, began sharing their own traditional knowledge. Thomas Running River, an elder of the local tribe, visited the Blackwood home one evening. Your wife understood something that many have forgotten, he told Mason and Sarah. The spirits of this land don't always reveal themselves, but when they do, it's for a purpose. They chose to save you, Mason, because they saw in you someone who could bridge two worlds, the world of humans and the world of the forest. As Thomas spoke, Sarah remembered more of her mother's stories. Tales she had dismissed as childhood fantasies about ancient guardians who protected the balance of nature. Now, those stories took on new meaning, connecting past and present in ways that sent shivers down her spine. The revelation about Jenny's connection to the mysterious wolves affected Mason deeply. During his daily walks, he found himself talking to Jenny as if she were still there, sharing his new understanding of what she had tried to tell him years ago. You were right, honey, he whispered to the forest one evening. There's so much more to this place than what we can see with our eyes. Dr. Collins, during Mason's final checkup, remained puzzled by his exceptional recovery. I've been reviewing similar cases, she admitted, and I can't find a single instance of someone healing this quickly from comparable injuries. It's as if, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. As if you had help we can't explain. The town of Willow Creek began to change in subtle ways. People spoke more quietly when entering the forest, showing a respect that went beyond conservation. Hunters reported strange experiences, moments when they felt watched, when game animals seemed to be led away from their sights by mysterious gray shadows. Sarah found herself drawn to her mother's old photography hobby, carrying a camera during her walks with her father. She captured images of the forest that seemed to reveal more than just trees and shadows. There was a depth to them, a sense of living presence that her mother had always tried to capture in her own photographs. As autumn painted the forest in brilliant shades of red and gold, the impact of Mason's experience continued to ripple through the community. The logging company's new conservation initiatives had begun to show results, with carefully planned selective harvesting replacing the old clear-cutting methods. Mason's role had evolved into that of a mediator between the industrial and natural worlds, drawing on his unique perspective to help find sustainable solutions. Sarah had taken her mother's journals to the local historical society, where they were carefully digitized and preserved. The detailed observations were proving valuable not just to wildlife researchers, but to a growing number of people interested in understanding the deeper connections between humans and the natural world. Jenny's writings about the white-patched wolf had become particularly significant as more people began sharing their own encounters with unusual wolf behavior in the area. One crisp morning, as Mason supervised a new logging operation, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. There, clear in the soft earth, were fresh wolf tracks, large ones, with a distinctive pattern he recognized immediately. The workers gathered around, their usual chatter falling silent as Mason knelt to examine the prints. "They're still watching over us," he said quietly, running his fingers along the edge of a perfect paw print, "making sure we keep our end of the bargain." The workers nodded solemnly, understanding that the bargain meant maintaining a balance between their need for lumber and the forest's need for preservation. Dr. Martinez had established a permanent research station near Willow Creek, focusing on studying wolf behavior and intelligence. Her team had documented several instances of wolves displaying unusual problem-solving abilities, though nothing quite as extraordinary as Mason's rescue. "What we're learning," she explained during a community presentation, "is that these animals have capabilities we're only beginning to understand. They're not just surviving in these woods, they're actively participating in maintaining its balance." The relationship between the town and the forest had shifted fundamentally. Local schools had incorporated environmental education programs, often taking students on guided walks where Mason would share his story and the lessons he'd learned. The children seemed to grasp intuitively what many adults struggled to accept: that the forest was more than just a collection of trees and animals, but a complex living system with its own wisdom. Sarah had started leading some of these educational programs herself, combining her mother's scientific observations with her father's extraordinary experience. She noticed how the students responded differently to the forest after hearing their story. They moved more carefully among the trees, spoke more softly, and showed a respect that went beyond what they'd been taught. During one of these educational walks, a young girl raised her hand. "Miss Blackwood," she asked, her eyes wide with wonder, "do you think the wolves knew your mom too? Is that why they helped your dad?" The question caught Sarah off guard, but as she thought about the white-patched wolf appearing in both her mother's journals and her father's rescue, she couldn't dismiss the possibility. The mystery of the wolves had attracted attention from various researchers and documentarians, but Mason and Sarah were selective about which projects they supported. They had learned that some stories needed to maintain their mystery, that trying to explain everything could diminish its power. The forest held its secrets, revealing them only to those who approached with respect and humility. One evening, as Mason and Sarah walked their usual path along the forest edge, they heard a distant howl. It was answered by several others, the sounds echoing through the trees in a haunting chorus. Father and daughter stood quietly, listening to what felt like an ancient conversation between the forest and its guardians. A year had passed since Mason's miraculous rescue, and the forest had gone through all its seasonal changes, each one revealing new aspects of its mystery. The spot where he had been trapped under the fallen tree had transformed, new growth had sprung up around the massive trunk, which now served as a nursery for countless seedlings and small creatures. Nature had turned what could have been a scene of tragedy into a symbol of renewal. The logging company's new approach to forest management had become a model for sustainable practices across the state. Other companies sent representatives to learn from what was now known as the Willow Creek method, a balanced approach that respected both economic needs and forest preservation. Mason found himself traveling to industry conferences, sharing not just practical advice about sustainable logging but also the deeper lessons he had learned about respecting the forest's ancient wisdom. Sarah had completed her college applications, but her plans had changed significantly from a year ago. Instead of pursuing business studies as she'd originally intended, she had decided to major in environmental science with a focus on wildlife biology. Her personal statement, which included the story of her father's rescue and her mother's research, had caught the attention of several prestigious universities. "You would be proud of her, Jenny," Mason said quietly one evening, standing at the kitchen window, watching Sarah photograph a family of deer at the forest's edge. "She's carrying on your work, but in her own way." The memory of his wife felt closer now than it had in years, as if understanding what she had known about the forest had somehow bridged the distance time had created. Dr. Martinez's research station had documented several more unusual wolf sightings, including multiple reports of the white-patched wolf. Trail cameras had captured images of wolves exhibiting behavior that defied conventional understanding, using tools, solving complex problems, and showing what appeared to be deliberate cooperation with other species. The scientific community remained divided on how to interpret these observations, but no one could deny that something extraordinary was happening in the forests around Willow Creek. Thomas Running River had become a regular visitor to the Blackwood home, sharing more of his people's traditional knowledge about the forest and its guardians. "The wolves chose to reveal themselves to you," he told Mason during one of their conversations. "But more importantly, you chose to listen. That's rarer than you might think. Many people experience unusual things in these woods, but they explain them away, forget them, and return to their old ways of thinking." The town's transformation had attracted attention from environmental groups and conservation organizations across the country. Willow Creek was becoming known as a place where industry and nature had found a way to coexist, where ancient wisdom and modern practices had achieved an unlikely balance. Tourism had increased, but in a controlled way that respected the forest's sanctity. One particularly meaningful change was the establishment of the Jenny Blackwood Memorial Scholarship, funded by the logging company and awarded annually to a local student pursuing environmental studies. The first recipient had been a young woman who had grown up hearing stories about the mysterious wolves, and had developed her own passion for wildlife conservation. Mason's leg had healed completely, defying Dr. Collins's initial prognosis. She had eventually stopped trying to explain his remarkable recovery in purely medical terms. Sometimes, she admitted during his final checkup, "We have to accept that there are things in this world that medicine can't fully explain." The forest itself seemed different now, or perhaps it was just that people had learned to see it differently. The loggers reported feeling a sense of being watched while they worked, not in a threatening way, but as if their actions were being monitored by ancient and wise observers. They took greater care with their cuts, showed more respect for the wildlife, and some even reported hearing distant howls that seemed to approve or disapprove of their activities. On the anniversary of Mason's rescue, the town of Willow Creek gathered for the dedication of the Jenny Blackwood Wildlife Observatory, a facility built at the edge of the forest where researchers and visitors could study and observe the local wildlife, while maintaining a respectful distance. The building's design incorporated elements from both modern architecture and traditional Native American structures, symbolizing the bridge between different ways of understanding the forest. Sarah stood beside her father as he cut the ribbon, both of them aware of the profound changes the past year had brought to their lives and their community. The observatory's main exhibition featured Jenny's journals, photographs, and scientific observations alongside documentation of Mason's extraordinary rescue. Dr. Martinez had helped create interactive displays explaining wolf behavior and intelligence, while Thomas Running River had contributed traditional stories about the forest's guardians. "Your mother always said that stories have power," Mason whispered to Sarah as they toured the facility. "They can change how people see the world." He paused at a large photograph of the forest taken by Sarah, where many visitors claimed they could sometimes glimpse a shadowy figure with a distinctive white patch moving among the trees. The photo had become something of a local legend, though neither Mason nor Sarah ever confirmed or denied what it might show. The logging company's transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. Under the new sustainable management practices, both the forest and the business were thriving. The workers had developed an almost spiritual approach to their work, treating the forest as a partner rather than a resource. They reported strange but wonderful experiences. Tools mysteriously moved to prevent accidents, warning howls before storms, and the occasional glimpse of wise eyes watching from the shadows. Dr. Martinez's research had attracted international attention, though she was careful to maintain the delicate balance between scientific inquiry and respect for the forest's mysteries. Some things, she often said, can be true without being fully explainable. Her team had documented enough unusual wolf behavior to fill several academic journals, but the most extraordinary events, like Mason's rescue, remained unique and profound. As twilight approached on the dedication day, Mason and Sarah took their familiar walk along the forest's edge. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and a cool breeze carried the ancient whispers of the trees. They stopped at their usual spot, where the view opened up to the vast expanse of wilderness that had changed their lives so completely. A movement in the underbrush caught their attention. There, in the gathering dusk, stood the white-patched wolf. It was the first time Sarah had seen it clearly, though she had caught glimpses over the past year. The wolf's intelligent eyes met theirs, conveying something that went beyond normal animal awareness. Behind it, barely visible in the shadows, were its companions, the same pack that had helped save Mason that fateful night. For a long moment, humans and wolves regarded each other in silence. No words were needed. The connection between them transcended language. The white-patched wolf dipped its head slightly, almost like a bow, before melting back into the forest with its pack. The message was clear: they were still there, still watching, still protecting the delicate balance between the human and natural worlds. As darkness settled over the forest, the distant sound of howls echoed through the trees. To Mason and Sarah, it sounded like a song of celebration, of harmony restored, of wisdom preserved and passed on. They knew that their story, like the forest itself, would continue to grow and evolve, inspiring others to look beyond the surface and recognize the profound connections that link all living things. Dear listeners, we hope Mason and Sarah's extraordinary tale has touched your hearts and opened your minds to the mysteries that surround us. The forest holds countless stories like this one, waiting to be discovered by those who approach with open hearts and respectful spirits. To continue exploring these remarkable tales of connection between humans and nature, we've prepared a special playlist of similarly moving stories. Find it by clicking the link to your left. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that explore the deep mysteries of life and the profound connections we share with the natural world. Share your own extraordinary encounters with nature in the comments below. Perhaps your story will inspire others to look more closely at the wonders that surround us all.